Good morning.
Thank you, Nathan, for leading that song. I think it's a beautiful song, and I think that it's good for us to appreciate the beauty in music. The primary reason we sing hymns is not for our ears, it's for God's. However, the reminder that we get when we do get to appreciate and enjoy beautiful music is a reminder of the beauty that God has surrounded us with. It points us back to the Creator. It points us back to our sharing in His nature as creative beings and as beings who enjoy beauty just as our wonderful God does also. We are continuing our series this morning in going through the books of Moses. Today we are continuing in Deuteronomy. Last time I covered Deuteronomy, I was very careful to promise at least two, not two. So we are in fact going to be firmly counting on a three-part Deuteronomy. Today is the second of which. The first sermon, you might remember, covered chapters 1 through 4. We look at Deuteronomy and we break it up mostly into 4 sermons. I quipped that I might rename Deuteronomy, if I could, as quadromaly, meaning 4 sermons, because that I think is a little bit more fitting than Deuteronomy, which simply means the second law, or second giving of the law. Moses does, in fact, repeat much of the law that he's given already in Exodus and Leviticus, and a little bit of Numbers. But mostly, it's thematic, and mostly, while he does endeavor to give the law to the people before going into Canaan, he primarily purposes to change their hearts, to fix their hearts before they go into the promised land. And so when we look at Deuteronomy, when we look at these 4 sermons in Deuteronomy, we see Moses conveying to the people their need for utter devotion to God. By way of reminder, with what we've seen through the first 4 books of Moses, the first 4 books of the Bible, that Genesis focused on the relationships and regeneration of all things. Exodus focuses on their deliverance, the deliverance of God's people from slavery, from bondage in Egypt, and to Mount Sinai, where they learn to worship the God that delivered them with an outstretched hand. In Leviticus, while they're at Sinai, now that the tabernacle has been set up, God now speaks to Moses from the tabernacle in the midst of the camp instead of from the top of the mountain at which they are camped. And he places his character and his nature and his name on his people. And he says, because I am holy, you will be holy. And this is what that's going to look like. These are the people, the Levites, who are going to keep you holy. And this is how they're going to do that. And centered on Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement. Numbers, called by the Jews to this day the wanderings, describes why they took so long to make what Deuteronomy begins with telling us is an 11 days journey. They spent 38 years in the wilderness because of their faithlessness. When the spies went in, came back with a bad report, 10-2, saying these guys are too big, these guys are too scary, we can't possibly. And so, because the people believed those 10 spies and insisted that they would not be able to do this, God punished them with 38 years, essentially 40 years of wandering, so that the generation that left Egypt would not go in to Canaan. Deuteronomy is next sequentially, but it is also next consequentially in theology. In what we're learning about God in the books of Moses, Deuteronomy is the next important point. The God that accomplished all of this, because he has accomplished all of this, deserves our response and our hearts forever. And when we look at Deuteronomy as a book of instilling devotion in God's people, we see that devotion as a consequence to the relationships and the regeneration established and accomplished in Genesis as a result of the deliverance from bondage initiated in Egypt, but as a type for our deliverance and from deliverance from all sin, from all idolatry, from all bondage. We see that because of all of this, this is the God that we should not only worship in holiness, but be devoted to and disciplined in our devotion. And so with that, we'll look back at the outline. I'll remind you that my title and the structure of our outline here is my titles for Moses' sermons. Okay? Don't read that as audacity, just trying to get this to fit in your notes in a convenient and memorable way. The first sermon talks about devoted eyes. Repeatedly in chapters 1 through 4, he talks about what you yourselves have seen with your own eyes. You saw God lead you out of Egypt. You saw God make peace between you and the Moabites and the Ammonites. You saw him deliver into your hands Og, king of Bashan, and the other guy, the king of Heshbon, right? And you've seen all that God has done for you, and that he's brought you here, and that he's preserved your lives in the wilderness. You've seen the Lord. So be devoted to the Lord. Both in fleeing from idolatry, keeping from idolatry, he makes the point in chapter 4, and certainly in utter devotion. So because of what your eyes have seen, these are the lives you ought to live. The bulk of Deuteronomy, most of Deuteronomy, is the sermon that we're going to cover today, and it has to do with devoted lives. We'll get into that here shortly. Next week David should be preaching, but the week after that, I plan to cover the last two sermons at once. I believe that it can be done despite the precedent that I've set. And we will go ahead and look at covering the last two sermons about being a devoted nation and receiving devoted blessings, as well as the last section, 31 through 34, of Moses' song, blessings, and death. So that's the outline of the five main sections into which I see Deuteronomy easily breaking up. But looking at today's text, the general outline for this sermon, and we're gonna look at slightly more in detail. There's a few highlights that we're going to hit. There's some really important parts of this, but before I get there, the reason that I'm taking a whole other sermon just for this one segment of Deuteronomy in the middle is because of the books of the Bible that we have less familiarity with, Deuteronomy is one of them that is quoted the most in the New Testament. I pointed this out in the first lesson, talking about the importance of Deuteronomy and some things to remember. It is the third most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. If that makes sense. There are 6 books of the New Testament that do not quote Deuteronomy, and everyone else does, and they do it a lot. Isaiah and Psalms have first and second place, respectively, and Deuteronomy is there in third place. So if we want to understand our New Testaments, we need to understand what they're referencing half the time, which mostly comes from Deuteronomy. So we have merit there, but also, this serves as the foundation. In fact, you can, if you want one more reason to appreciate some of the points in this, think of this morning as also setting up our class in Hosea. Some of the laws that he establishes in Deuteronomy are going to be exactly the infractions that he accuses the people of in Hosea, which we'll start studying, Lord willing, this Wednesday night in the adult class. And so when we look at this, this is kind of this is an in-depth look at, it's not really an in-depth look at this sermon, but it's an in-depth overview, if that makes sense, an in-depth survey, and preparation for Wednesday as well. So with that, when we look at this, where we left off our first sermon was actually going as far as verse 2 of chapter 5, where at the beginning of this sermon, he makes the point to the people that our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are here alive today. We talked about the fact that that's a mysterious statement, since the point of their 38 years in the wilderness was so that this would not be true, so that the generation going into Canaan would not be the generation that came out of Egypt. And so we can talk about those exceptions again if you need reminders. However, the point of this is first that he's contrasting these people with the patriarchs, their fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who did not receive the law of Moses, but it's with them. And second of all, he's impressing, and this is going to carry throughout Deuteronomy, and when you read the entire book, you'll see again and again mentions that this is for you and what you are supposed to do. and mentions of that. And the idea is that the Lord's covenant with his people is intended to be perceived as personal with every generation. It's not something that generically this power that we haven't seen much of did some great things allegedly for our great-great-great-great-grandparents. And so that's why we still worship the way we do and why we do it. No, it's with you that he's made this covenant. And we made the point that for Christians today, we should view the gospel the same way. That it is for you and it is for me that Christ died. Yes, his blood covers our fathers. Yes, many of our parents were in covenant with God through Christ. However, your relationship with God is not a continuation of your mother's or your father's relationship with God. It is your relationship with God. And so we, like the Israelites, owe to God devoted lives. In chapter 5, he talks about why you were given the law. Or at least that's how I look at this section breaking down. I'll stop making that disclaimer as we go on. Know that it applies to all of this. This is not an inspired outline. That said, he recaps for them. He gives them their history, and he does this throughout Deuteronomy. Each of these sermons, he gives them their history, and from their history, he makes a point. Here, he gives the Ten Commandments to them. But the point is not Moses saying, okay, now these are the 10 commandments that are going to be the cornerstone of our faith and our religion and our relationship with God. He's saying, remember the day when God spoke to you all. When we were all camped at the base of Horeb, he paints the picture. He describes the scene in this text. And he says, we gathered around, we saw this trembling, shaking mountain. We saw it fire and smoke. We saw all of this glory and presence of God irrefutably. And then we heard his voice. And he spoke to the congregation of Israel these 10 commandments. And then he repeats the 10 commandments that they heard first from the mouth of God. And then he says, but remember what happened after that? He says, these words, look at verse 22. The Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, behold, Yahweh, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire as we have, and has still lived? Moses, you go near and hear all the Lord will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear it and do it. Remember that happens. God speaks to them, they tremble, and they're afraid, and they say, exactly what we just read, that we just heard God's voice, and we still live. We're not going to push that. I always wondered, I wondered for a very long time, how God felt about that. If that was cowardice, was that weakness? Did God intend to give the whole law orally to the entire congregation? Or is this how they were supposed to react? And a good answer for questions like that is to keep reading. Because after the Lord heard your words in verse 28, because he heard the words that you spoke to me, the Lord said, I have heard the words of this people. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear, I lost my spot there. To fear me and to keep all my commandments, that it might go well with them and with their descendants forever. Tell them to go back to their tents. You come up here, Moses. I'll speak to you. You bring it to them. At the onset, in his intro to giving them the law, he says, I wish that you and every generation after you people could have the same heart that you did for that moment. In that moment, Israel finally had the right attitude, the right view of Almighty God. It's an incredible blessing that we have heard him, but we are unworthy of hearing him, and we cannot stand before his face. Moses, you go and intercede. God says, oh, that you would have his heart always to fear me and keep my commandments. It's noteworthy that fear is discussed 18 times just in this sermon. It's 11 more times for a total of 29 in the book of Deuteronomy, for those who like data points like that. But 18 times in this sermon, he talks about fear. He talks about who not to be afraid of, who's going to be afraid of the Israelites because of God, and ultimately, most often, fear God. In chapter 6, which is maybe the chapter of Deuteronomy we know best, we have the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. He goes on to institute family practice, daily living, sharing the law with your children and within your house. This is what you talk about. When you want to talk, this is what you talk about. When you have nothing else to talk about, when you're walking, when you're eating, when you're sleeping, as soon as you're done sleeping, this is what you're talking about. This is going to be on your hearts, and that's going to be evident from the way that you speak in private. Not just when you come together in the assembly of God's people. Not just when it's religious time. Not just when you're at the feast and you're thinking about all the things, the questions we're supposed to ask and answer about the Passover and so on and so forth. He says this, and the point of this, he says in 20, there in chapter 6, verse 20, is that when your sons ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of all of this? Some paraphrasing there. You say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. If you notice, the first person prescription. Again, going back to the point from 5 and verse 2, they're supposed to identify firsthand with God's deliverance. Every generation of Israel is to identify firsthand with having seen God's might, seen God's works, and therefore fearing him and loving him and serving him and obeying him. And that devotion, that completely saturating devotion, is how we're to keep the law first and foremost. He goes on to talk about the reasons for keeping the law in chapters 7 through 11. That's something that he emphasizes. And I think I alluded to this in the last sermon. But that twice in this passage, he gives them reasons not to think that they are chosen by God. That is, he says in chapter 7, verse 7, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you. In fact, he says, because you were the fewest of all peoples. But it's because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. So don't think that it's because you're such a great nation that God has chosen you. God chose you long ago and made you a great nation. In chapter 9, he says, do not say in your heart, in verse 4, after God has thrust out your enemies before you, do not say that it's because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. In fact, he goes on to say it's because of the wickedness of these people that I'm driving them out of the land. And it's not because of your righteousness in verse 5 or the uprightness of your heart, but because of the wickedness of these nations. Continuing, he says that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers. He says in 6, no, again, he emphasizes, know that he's not giving you this good land because of your righteousness. In fact, you're a stubborn people. If your attitude is a factor in this story, it's because it shows all that God overcame to be faithful to your fathers. If your attitude has anything to do with you being in the land, it's a demonstration on massive scale of God's compassion and forgiveness and slowness to anger. That's what your attitude has contributed to this equation of you now going into this promised land. It's because I'm faithful to the promise that I made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In fact, he goes on, he gives a continued history lesson and saying, here's all of the instances, or just some highlights of instances that prove that you are unworthy of this. By your conduct, your righteousness is not why you're here. Let me remind you. Remember the calf you made while I was there talking to the God you feared so greatly just days before? Remember the first set of tablets that I brought down and shattered because I was so distraught at how egregiously you were sitting there at the foot of a trembling mountain? In chapter 10, if we look at verse 12 through the end of the chapter, through verse 22 there, that's the thesis statement for this sermon, or at least the beginning of it. In chapter 10, even if we just look at, we can't look at verses 24 through 29, so those must be notes for a different section. But if we look at these verses, we can look especially at well, we'll start at 12, and we'll jump and we'll hit a few bits there. He says, "Now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you?" Reminiscent of the passage we probably remember in Micah 6 and verse 8. This is the first time we see this statement. "What does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and the statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good." This is what God desires from you. This is the expectation. And so he says, he reminds them of the power of God. He says, "To the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it." And yet, of all of this, the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are today. You need to understand the inversion, the stark contrast between God's awesome power and the intimate love that is expressed in his choosing specifically you to be his people. And so he says, circumcise, 16, he says, "Circumcise your hearts and no longer be stubborn." And then he works out again and he says, "Because the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the fatherless and loves the sojourner. Therefore you love the sojourner." And in verse 20 and following, "You fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and hold fast to him. By his name you shall swear. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done for you these things great and terrifying that your eyes have seen. And now he's brought you here, who from a few fathers has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven." Before he lays down the law, before he goes on about all of the specific and nuanced things that they're supposed to do and the things that they are supposed to never do, he says, I need you, before you hear these details, I need you to know it matters, and I need you to know why it matters, and I need you to believe in your heart of hearts that it truly, truly matters. That God has earned your devotion, and when I give you these laws, this is not for your illness. This is not to constrict you and lay upon you some burden that you are unable to bear, though the New Testament refers to it that way in hindsight. It's not to oppress you. It's not. I'm not talking to you this morning to bore you. Moses was not talking to them to give them this law to bore them. He was talking to them because this is what defines them. As you and I think about what defines who we are, we think about being defined by our past. And we might think of that in frustration. We might think of that as a determined fact of life. And to some degree, fine, but choose to be defined by the past evidence of God's deliverance and hand in your life. Do not say for a moment that you have the law of God because you are so righteous that he gave it to you. Do not say for a moment that you keep God's covenant, this new covenant in Christ's blood, because of your righteousness or because you're such a great people. That's not it at all. all your character, all my character has contributed to the equation of being delivered from sin and promised eternal life, is all that God has had to overcome to show in my life his steadfast mercy and his enduring patience. The last chapter I want to look at in depth. We're going to hit some more highlights, but the last chapters are 12 and 13. This is where he starts to now transition and actually tell them what they're going to do. Noteworthy while you're getting to chapter 12, the last paragraph in chapter 11, starting with verse 26, is the first mention of Ebal and Gerizim, which is going to be a factor in the third and fourth sermons. I think especially the fourth sermon. No, it's the third. Final answer. That said, there's that forward look, and this is where he's saying, okay, now I'm setting before you the law. This has all been, 5 through 11 has all been the introduction. Now let's get after it, right? Let's get to the meat of God's law. And he starts with the Lord's chosen place of worship, which would not immediately take shape, especially not in the way that we think of it. But note that this passage is actually not even just talking about the temple in Jerusalem or the tabernacle's appointed place in Shiloh. It's not just talking about those places. In fact, when you look, it's talking about the appointed places within your tribes. This is where you're supposed to go for every sacrifice. He says first, the first section there, he's talking about in verse 1 through 7, when you come into this land, eliminate, abolish, devote to utter destruction every trace of the idolatry that the peoples before you were practicing. Wipe it all out, remove every trace of idolatry. And then in verses 10 and following, especially 8 and following, he says, and then when you see something and you know, I'm kind of hungry, this might be about the right time for me to make this sacrifice or that one. He says, don't do that just wherever you are. If it's a sacrifice to God, you go to the places appointed. You go to, and what would be described later is that these are the places where the Levites, the places that the Levites maintained in the midst of the people because they didn't have their own inheritance. Verses 8 and 9, he says, you shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes. If you've ever wondered how God feels about that statement, everyone doing whatever is right in their own eyes, this might inform that. He says, for you have not yet come to the rest and to the inheritance the Lord God is giving you. Going on, he says, when you do go over at Jordan, when you do come into the land the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, when he does give you rest from your enemies, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, contributions that you present, your finest vow offerings, all of this. In verse 12, he talks about who would participate in there, and he mentions at the end of that list, the Levite that is within your towns. He has no other portion or inheritance with you. And so he says, take care in verse 13 and 14 that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. That's where you offer your burnt offerings, and there you do all that I'm commanding you. He goes on in the rest of the chapter. He says, now here's the balance. Now you get hungry for meat. You can eat meat whenever you want to, as long as it's none of the holy things. As long as it's none of the things you're supposed to be sacrificing. You can eat as you ought to, whenever you feel like it, unless what you want to eat has to do with sacrifice. In chapter 13, so we're going to be devoted in our worship, and we're not ever going to take worship into our own hands, which comes into the factor in Saul's kingship, and certainly in Jeroboam's and all of Israel's, just deciding that, well, we feel like worshiping here at Dan and Bethel and Beersheba instead of there at Jerusalem. So devotion in how and where you worship. But in chapter 13, this is kind of an Old Testament parallel text to Galatians 1, verses 8 and 9, which is where Paul says twice, if anyone among you ever, even an angel from heaven, preaches any other gospel, let him be accursed. Deuteronomy 13 is that. He says, if a prophet or a dreamer, somebody comes to you and tells you they have this vision and God now wants us to go and worship the Baals, don't listen to him. In fact, kill him. And then he says in verse 6, if your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or your wife, or your friend who is as your own soul, he's thinking of the most intimate relationships that we have. If any one of these people says, you know what, I really think we should worship Baal this once. Or maybe forever, who knows? I mean, it couldn't hurt to add more. Not only does he say, kill him, he says in verse 8, you shall not yield to him or listen to him. Your eye shall not pity him. You shall not spare him. You shall not conceal him. You shall kill him, and your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and after that, the hand of all the people. And then in the next section, starting in verse 12, he says, if you hear that in one of the other cities, that somebody has come in, some worthless fellow, he calls it, modern translation would be some rando, right, comes into one of these cities and you hear about one of these cities now worshiping these other gods. He says, first, you're going to go and you're going to check it out. You're going to see if that's true or not. And then if it is true, burn it down. The whole city. Everyone in the city, all the cows that belong to the people in the city, all of their stuff, devoted to utter and complete destruction. And we get the idea of sticky fingers maybe from this, because he says in verse 16, he's talking about gathering all its spoil and offering it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. The city will not be built again. None of the devoted things, there it is in verse 17, shall stick to your hand. Warning exactly what Achan goes against in the beginning of Joshua, right? Don't think, well, this is shiny. I know that these people were evil, but this is shiny and this is nice. Oh, let's keep this. No, devote it all to destruction. Here's the point I want to make. One of the first things God does in establishing his law is set up who is accountable for the practice and the exercise of the law. And on a top tier level, generally, the Levites, because it's to the Levites in all of their cities and all their towns and all their tribes and all their areas, the Levites are supposed to make sure that the people know the law. But he doesn't say, when your best friend starts practicing idolatry, tell your Levite. He says, you deal with it. It's pretty much what Matthew 18 says, isn't it? He builds in accountability and he puts it on the individual. He says, you, whoever you are that is hearing these words right now, you need to know this and you need to be ready. We need to be completely devoted, and we need to help each other be completely devoted. Last note here is that we have one of the most important phrases in connection with commands for capital punishment. And it comes at the end of verse 5. He says, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. And then in verse 11, all Israel shall hear and fear and never again do any such wickedness as this among you. We have New Testament commands as well to purge out leaven and to keep an unleavened lump, as the New Testament talks about it. The demand for holiness looks like keeping each other accountable, and looks like calling out sin and dealing with sin urgently and immediately. Not hiding it, not saying, well, I know his heart is good, he just needs some time. Deal with it. Here's the fast part. One way to break up this body section of the speech, and you could slice out chapter 26 and call that the conclusion of the matter. That's how we're going to treat it when we get there. However, 12 and 13 is devotion through your worship, through where you worship and not letting anyone lead you away from worship. In 14 through 18, we deal with unclean food, food laws at the beginning of 14, tithes at the end of 14. Sabbath years is what takes up chapter 15, and feasts take up the bulk of chapter 16, though there is, interestingly, a blurb at the end of 16 about justice and being devoted to justice and executing justice and prioritizing justice, because we serve a just God. In chapter 17, a lot is going on, but to zoom in on just one more part, the last half of chapter 17, starting in verse 14, is about kings. When you come into the land God is giving you, you possess it, you dwell in it, and you say, I'm going to set a king over me like all the nations around me, which is exactly how this plays out in 1 Samuel chapter 7 and 8. Here's how that's going to look. It's not going to be a foreigner. He must not acquire horses for himself in verse 16, so on and so forth. 17, shall not acquire many wives for himself. And then the end of 17, nor acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Solomon goes 0 for 3, pretty famously, on those commands not to do these things. However, what I do want to emphasize is a very specific command that was given to every king that was going to sit on the throne. Noteworthy, here in Deuteronomy, God doesn't say, when you're going to make this request, this is an evil request. I'm supposed to be your king, and you should never do this. He doesn't say that here. It may very well be God's sentiment, and that's borne out more in 1 Samuel. However, what he does say here is that when you do appoint a king, here's what's going to need to happen. That guy's first day in office, he needs to sit down and he needs to transcribe. He needs to handwrite out the law. He's going to have a Levite proofread his copy of the law. And then he's going to read that thing every day. Now, what he does not say is that the king is going to do this so that he can be the executive branch of the Levitical priesthood and be the cause of wiping out everybody who does evil. It's not so that we have this law enforcement side of the law. That's not the reason he gives. The motivation for the king being intimately familiar with the law of God is so that his heart, in verse 20, may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left. Specifically, this is dealing with kings. This is also accurate for all of us. And elsewhere in this sermon, he makes a similar point. That the part of the purpose of the law is that we stay humble. Like we talked about in chapter 9, it's not because of your righteousness. You're stubborn people. God loves you and is faithful to your fathers. Your attitude isn't why you're in a good relationship. So we should know the law so that our hearts do not get lifted up. In chapter 18, verse 15 on, talks about installing the new prophetic system, and that after Moses, others would come, and that would be how God deals with his people. Understanding that passage is not going to be something we take time to do today, but is useful in understanding Hebrews 1. And this is also messianic in the fact that Jesus is one like Moses, who was raised up to deliver the word of God. In chapter 20, he deals with the rules of war, the way that they should act in war. Chapter 21 ends, verses 22 through 23, are about cursed is anyone who dies on a tree. Galatians points out Christ's fulfillment of that passage. That's worth noting. Chapter 22 begins with dispelling the notion that finders are keepers. Interestingly, in this set of miscellaneous laws, he says if you find something that doesn't belong to you, find who it does belong to, and if you don't know, you hang on to it until whoever it belongs to comes looking for it. Finders keepers is not biblical. Thought that was interesting. Most of the rest of that chapter is about sexual immorality and what to do in various cases. Uncleanness is primarily dealt with in 23, and then 24 begins with talking about divorce, but most of that has to do with, most of the rest of that chapter, I should say, has to do with how we treat our families and how we imbue compassion in our business dealings in daily life. 25 has more assorted laws and deals a lot of them with who Levites are allowed to marry and in different circumstances, so on and so forth. The last bit. In chapter 26, the way that this particular sermon ends, he says, "This day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and rules." Real quick, the last thing that he covers is offerings and tithes. So all of this comes back to, in the middle there's a lot of how you're going to live every day. But then the last main point is this is what you're going to give to God, and everything that you have, you're going to prioritize what you give to God. And then we come to 16. God commands you to do these statutes and rules. You shall be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. It's not a disembodied law that you have to follow these rules. With your heart, follow this law. With all your soul, follow this law. And obey his voice. And let's jump down to verse 18. The Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession, as he has promised you, that you are to keep all his commandments, and that he will set you in praise and in fame and in honor high above all nations that he has made, and that you shall be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he has promised. It does not look the same today. God's chosen nation, that as we know it, does not occupy a very specific stretch of land by the Mediterranean. It fills the earth. And people from all nations of the earth flock to it and take refuge in its branches. However, the citizens of God's kingdom, his chosen nation, are to be holy as he is holy, and are to be devoted and to be obedient to all of his laws, not just because, this is just another tedious thing that comes with being a Christian, so I guess I'll do it. No, but from the heart, with sincerity and with our souls, worship our God who is spirit and truth, in spirit and in truth. If we're subject to the invitation and can be helped to be holy as God is holy, repent of anything, or put on Christ in baptism, becoming one of his chosen people, whatever the case may be, if we can help you this morning, let us know how. By coming forward as together we stand and sing.